Earth is crammed with heaven, and every common bush afire with God. But only he who sees takes off his shoes, the rest sit around and pluck blackberries. My dear sisters and brothers, earth is indeed crammed with God, and every common bush afire with God. But do we notice it? Do we experience it? Do we feel it? The gospel of the day calls our attention to the temple of God, to the church where we gather for worship, where we come into contact with God. And you and I see the church as a meeting place for us and God, and for us, the people of God. As we go through the Old Testament, the book of Genesis in particular, we come across this tent where God would meet his people, where prophets would have access to God. And the tent served as a meeting place, the tent as a tent of presence. And so as you and I gather in our own tent, this tent of God, this church, this temple of God, it is to come into contact with God, to have that experience with God, to have those moments of intimacy with God, where heaven is made available to us in a way, because heaven is where God is. And God makes himself available to us in this space. And so I see the church, this meeting place, this tent of presence, as an opportunity to come into contact with God, so that having experienced him here, as we go out to elsewhere, we may experience him there as well. This time of worship is for us to be able to taste God, his presence, communion with him, so that when we get away to the rest of the day, we can have a taste of God, that experience of God, also during the rest of the day. You know, I grew up in a Salesian school where it was always written, God is everywhere. And then eventually, as I became a religious and then was ordained a priest, I also grew up to the notion that God is not just everywhere, but God is also anytime. That whenever you want, you can have access to God, because God is always in communion with you. God is always in communication with you. The question is, are we in touch with God everywhere? Are we in communion with God anytime? And then, as we go through the various situations of the day, I also begin to learn that God is not just everywhere, and God is not just anytime, but God is in everything. And the truth is that if you cannot find God in everything, you will not find him in anything. If you don't find God everywhere, you will not find God anywhere. And so I say it again, earth is crammed with heaven, and every common bush afire with God. But only he, only she who sees it takes off his or her shoes. The rest sit around plucking blackberries. To conclude, taking off one's shoes, God would tell Moses, take off your shoes. The ground on which you stand is holy. Not because that is a forbidden ground, but because God wants us to treat it as a welcoming ground. And He wants us to knock off those shoes, that dead leather, so that we could feel Him with our own skin. Because God is to be felt, God is to be experienced, and Christianity tells us that God is to be tasted. That's how one would see incarnation. That is how I would see the Eucharist. And so, earth is crammed with heaven, and every common bush afire with God. But only he who sees takes off his shoes. The rest sit around plucking blackberries. And what are you doing? Are you taking off your shoes and experiencing God, or are you sitting around plucking blackberries?